Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the next in our Wild Conversation series. We're really excited today to have Isabella from the ACLU of Minnesota, along with Joy Wang, who will be our moderator. Before we begin, I just wanted to cover a few quick housekeeping things. We are using a Zoom webinar, and this is being recorded. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And if for any reason we need to restart this webinar, please check your email for a new link. The Wild Conversation series is part of the Wanted and Justice Legal Detail, which is part of Twin Cities Diversity in Practice. And Wild started this summer after the killing of George Floyd. And the mission of Wild is to harness the collective power of TC-DIP's membership and our legal community to try to start to remedy systemic anti-Black racism in the Twin Cities. And we do this by partnering with and amplifying the work of existing community organizations, including the ACLU of Minnesota. We're really excited to have our moderator, who is Joy Wang. Joy is a part of our Emerging Leaders group, and she's an associate at Norton Rose Fulbright. And be sure to check out our next Wild Conversation series on December 11th, next week, from 9 to 10 a.m. And for our next section, we will have Andrea Brown, who's an assistant public defender for Ramsey County. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joy and Isabella. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumra. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. And it's my honor to moderate today's conversation with Isabella Nascimento from the ACLU. Before I begin, I really want to encourage everyone to send questions to us throughout the conversation. When Isabella and I chatted recently, she said she is the most interested in learning about what you all think about these conversations and what you are the most excited or worried about with regard to the discussions about defunding or abolishing police. And she really hoped this is a dialogue. So I will be watching the questions, and I will also try to save some time at the end of the conversation for Q&A. So Isabella is a staff attorney who represents clients who have had their civil liberties threatened or violated. Her background is in indigent criminal defense, racial justice, and police accountability. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota and her law degree from the University of Chicago Law School. Previously, Isabella interned with the Legal Rights Center, a public defender organization in Minneapolis, the Bronx Defenders in New York, the Cook County Public Defender's Office in Chicago, and the Orleans Public Defender in New Orleans. She also clerked for the Honorable Catherine Easterly, a former Public Defender Service appellate attorney who is now on the bench on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. When she's not fighting for civil liberties, she enjoys spending time with her family and her puppy, Rafi. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Isabella. Can you please begin by first telling us a bit more about how you got into the work of criminal defense, racial justice, and police accountability? Have you always been wanting to do this kind of work?
Thank you so much for having me today. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So to answer your question, Joy, I got into more public defense type work kind of by accident. I was an undergrad at the U, had a criminal law course over the summer, happened to have a speaker from the Legal Rights Center come in and present, decided I wanted to intern there. So I applied, got lucky, and just really fell in love with the work while I was there. I went into law school completely on track to just be a public defender. I had blinders on, was going in. But obviously you have to take an array of classes, and I was lucky enough to take a lot of different civil rights classes and clinics. And the clinics were what really spurred my passion, and where I found kind of this intersection point between public defense and civil rights work, and how I could do both in a sense. So I was in the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic where I was representing indigent clients. And then I was also in our Civil Rights and Police Accountability Clinic, in which we took a case to trial of a 17-year-old unarmed Black boy who was shot and killed by a white police officer in Illinois. At that point, it really became obvious to me that the same individuals who are so often targeted and marginalized by the criminal legal system are also those who are constantly being oppressed and targeted by other systems as well, and often have their civil liberties violated. And they don't often have a seat at tables of power to be able to respond and work most effectively for change. And so it is something that I'm really passionate about, and being able to get those players at the table so that they can vocalize and let people know what they need. Hopefully that answered your question.
Definitely, and that's really amazing, and it's very important work that a lot of us really appreciate. So tell us a little bit more about your current job. How did you get to your current position, and how long have you been at the job?
Yes, so I actually just started with the ACLU in February of this year. I really lucked out because I was looking and was debating between public defense and civil rights work, kind of meshing my two loves. And it happened that the ACLU had an opening. I applied. I was lucky that they selected me, and I'm now a staff attorney there. It just so happened that at that time, the ACLU of Minnesota was looking to expand their legal team. So at the same time that I got hired, 2 other attorneys also got hired. We now have the most attorneys that the organization's ever had. It's growing, it's great. And so, yeah, I'm coming up on a year. It's been a really fantastic year, and I love my job.
Cool. So how many people are there in your team, and what's the structure like?
Yes, so my team has, I want to say 7 attorneys and a paralegal, but the team really stretches beyond that because we have 3 different departments, although, well, actually many different departments, but 3 different kind of branches. So we have the legal branch, community engagement organization branch, and then we also have the legislation and policy branch. Those different programs or teams we couldn't possibly do our work effectively without also our philanthropy department and our communications media team, who are fantastic. And so it's really an all hands on deck kind of situation. When we have cases, we try to marry what our objectives are. So maybe litigation isn't the best way to go about trying to bring about some type of change. And it's actually better doing grassroots organizing or legislation and policy.
So, so what are the specific roles for each of these, and generally, how does it work? Like, if you hear about something like a case, and what's the process like?
So, I guess is the question, how do my cases arise?
Yes, yeah, you were mentioning about the 3 different departments. I was wondering, what each function is, and then, what your role is in this process. So
sure. So I focus exclusively on litigation. I've had very little crossover into the other departments. So, for example, I haven't had to go testify in the state Congress. That being said, it's not unheard of. Many of our attorneys have done so. I've just been there for such a short time that I haven't had that. Plus, COVID really puts a damper on in-person things. That being said, our cases, I think one of the best parts of my job is that, and the growth of the organization right now, is that we are creating more and more capacity to really respond nimbly to issues as they arise, and at the same time be able to continue with our caseload that we have where we're bringing proactive litigation. One example of that is just with this pandemic that no one could have predicted. One of the major things that we're seeing are widespread outbreaks of COVID in prisons. And without having so many attorneys on our team, We couldn't, for example, pick up and respond and just start bringing lawsuits to try to improve the conditions and keep people safe in prisons from COVID. And so that's one of the things that I'm currently working on. It's not something that obviously I was going to have been working on, but I had to pivot my attention, and we just happen to have more people on the team that can pick up and start running with issues as they come up.
So how do you guys usually identify and select the cases?
So our cases all originate with the fact that there have been some sort of civil rights that have been threatened or violated. And it has to be by a government actor. At that point, the question is, what is the best way to be able to make systemic change? That doesn't have to be a lawsuit. It could be through a new law that we try and push for to get passed. So implementing legislation. But for my purposes, it's through cases, through casework. And so in that moment, we have an intake process. Our intake form online is, you fill it out, it comes directly to our team. We call through all of the intakes that are submitted, and we choose the litigation strategically to follow our strategic plan, which outlines specific policies. So advancing issues of racial justice, immigration, individual liberties, voting rights, and free speech, obviously, as the ACLU was founded on. But all of these things are going to impact Minnesotans and anyone really who's in Minnesota. And so we try to pick the litigation where a civil liberties issue has been identified, people's civil liberties have been violated or threatened, and we're going to have the greatest impact for the greatest number of people to be able to protect and uphold both the federal and the Minnesota Constitution.
So how do you feel about the current work you do compare with your work as a public defender? Like, what are the similarities or differences?
So the differences there, well, more obvious ones are that I'm doing civil litigation now versus criminal litigation before. The other kind of big difference is that previously I was responding to a case because I was working as a defense attorney or student attorney to many defense attorneys, versus now we're proactively bringing litigation, right? We're starting a case. So kind of main differences there. That being said, the similarity for me and the reason that I can do this work, despite the fact that I love public defense work and my heart still lies there, is that the clients are the same. And the people that I work for and that I get to hear their stories and work on behalf of, those are the same. And that's heartbreaking in a way, because you just see how many different places they're being trodden upon and beaten and oppressed and silenced. And at the same time, it's an honor to be able to get to work for them and that they place their trust in me to speak on their behalf. So they are the reason I continue to do the work. And it's the main similarity I see, and I'm really glad and really lucky that I get to do it.
Speaking of your clients and people who are being oppressed by the system, makes me think about obviously the killing of George Floyd was big event this year. So I imagine the incident has had some big impact on your job. And can you please tell us a little bit more about how it has affected your job and what changes you have seen?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a little bit ago, one of the best things about the ACLU of Minnesota having been kind of going through its growth spurt right now is that we have more capacity to respond to issues as they arise. The murder of George Floyd was a devastating moment in our community's history, recent history. able to pivot. And so now some of my caseload also includes cases that relate to and have responded to the murder of George Floyd and the protests that resulted therefrom. It's been a very tough time. That being said, I'm really thankful that there is space to be able to respond to those and still be able to carry on our other cases, because the other cases really matter. We don't want to let those individuals down. We're bringing cases on their behalf, and we still need to continue to propel those forward. We also have to have the capacity to be able to respond to things as they arise, such as police accountability, transparency, and really upholding civil liberties in real time. And so the response to the murder of George Floyd was one way to do that.
Do you happen to have a ballpark estimation of like how many more cases you have received or you have handled this year that are related to the murder of George Floyd?
So I have 2 additional cases on my docket right now because of the protests that came after the murder of George Floyd. So in response, obviously, as I think everyone in the community knows, there were a number of protests, and those protesters were met with precisely the police brutality that they were protesting against, by the use of chemical munitions, so tear gas, less lethal projectiles like rubber bullets, tracker markers, other projectiles. And so we've brought 2 cases because of that. The first is a case on behalf of media who were directly targeted by law enforcement in use of chemical munitions and less lethal projectiles. And the other is on behalf of all of the protesters who were similarly targeted. Both of those cases are in very early stages of litigation, so I can't go into too much detail about them. That being said, we are hopeful and pushing forward with them. They will carry on. We'll see them to the end. It is heartbreaking that in those moments, individuals who both were trying to shine a light on the protests, so the media, as well as those who were taking to the streets to be able to use their First Amendment right to be able to express their outrage and pain and suffering in a moment in which their community member was murdered and they watched, that they were met with that type of violence.
Yeah, definitely. So do you feel that because of the additional caseload or because of everyone's trying to respond to the murder of George Floyd in the community, has your work become more or less difficult? And have you received more or less support from your organization and the community?
So the first thing I'll say is that in response to both the murder of George Floyd and then the resulting protests in his honor, there was an outpouring of support, both in terms of volunteers and financial support and everything to the ACLU. It is not going unused. We are bringing more cases. We are strategically using volunteers to the best that we can. I encourage everyone to continue to want to be engaged, to come volunteer, to do whatever you can to get involved, because the more hands on deck that we have, the more good we can do to uphold and safeguard civil liberties. The work, whether it's become more or less difficult, is in itself a difficult question, because much like the community members who were responding in protest to their pain and outrage and grief, we too are community members. I grew up here in Minnesota. I'm from Rochester. I have lived up in the Twin Cities for I don't know how long now. I'm a person of color, a woman. I have a son who's a person of color. And so I too have to respond and grieve to that moment. But to be able to do my job, I also need to be able to set that aside to some extent, and show up for other people. And so it can be taxing to be working on these types of issues. That said, it's very rewarding work and motivating and inspiring to want to keep going. But it can be very tiring as well.
Yeah, definitely self-care and take care of yourself. Yeah. So what kind of systematic changes do you hope to see coming from the cases that are brought by the ACLU related to the protests and the murder of George Floyd?
So I think the first thing is that it needs to be recognized that police violence disproportionately affects people of color. And with that, the ACLU of Minnesota's vision is that we live in a nation and a state where no community has to fear the police, where arrests and the use of force by law enforcement are last resorts and not first options, and that everyone, regardless of where they live, can be safe and healthy. We also want to see that when people are expressing themselves and utilizing their First Amendment rights, that they are given the space to do so. With that, I think that those are big goals. And so I'm hopeful that we will see those things come out of these cases. Litigation takes a long time, and hopefully we'll see change sooner rather than later, but also patience is key. And so we'll keep fighting.
Yeah. So with that, I was segueing into my next question about the topic of defunding police or abolishing police, a big conversation that's happening in the community since the murder of George Floyd, and actually, way before that. But so what is your take on this, and what does it mean when people say defunding the police, and what does it mean about abolishing the police? What's your opinion?
So, as an initial note, the term defunding has become particularly polarizing, politicized. In the way that I use it, in the way that the ACLU of Minnesota discusses the concept, it means divestment or diversion of some funding from traditional forms of policing and investment of that money instead into community programs that keep everyone in all of our neighborhoods safe and healthy. What that in practice would look like is that money should be spent on things like violence prevention, creating a team of first responders with mental health experience or substance abuse experience, so that we can avoid sending armed police officers to handle issues that they're not being trained to handle, not through a fault of their own, but just they are not equipped or the best responders to send to that situation. And so we should be investing the money rather than always funneling it to their budget, is just to move that money somewhere else so that other better equipped teams can be sent to respond to different issues. As for abolishing the police, so groups that abolish the police would like to see no police in society at all, whether that happens all at once or gradually. I'll say that the ACLU of Minnesota supports divestment, meaning diverting money and reinvesting in community services like violence prevention teams, affordable housing, schools, first responders who have backgrounds in mental health care, substance abuse issues, or other specialized issues that don't necessarily need an armed police response. If you're asking for my personal opinion, so this doesn't reflect the views of the organization, I support divestment in the short term. In the long term, I imagine a society in which no police exist, not necessarily because of abolition to say, oh, police are terrible, we should get rid of them, but in that we would exist in a society in which police are simply no longer needed. the best way I can explain that is that I work every single day to put myself out of a job. I would love to not have a job at the ACLU of Minnesota because everyone's civil liberties are always protected. And so I am simply useless. I would love to see a society in which prisons no longer exist because we've re-envisioned what justice looks like. And so the emphasis is on rehabilitation and not retribution. And I would love to see a society, for example, in which prosecutors are similarly obsolete. And I hope that they too work every day to put themselves out of a job because they are ministers of justice and not just advocates. So in that way, I support abolition insofar as I support abolition of many different problematic institutions and would love nothing more than for myself to be unemployed and have to find other work.
Yeah. I don't know if this will be appropriate to share or not, but what do you think is the reason that between these two options, ACLU supports the defunding, but not the abolition?
So I think that that's a difficult question to answer just because the traction for these movements and really the spotlight on these movements is recent. And so it's something that has been an ongoing conversation, but not in kind of popular circles. That was not something that everyone was aware of or talking about, and now has been. And like I mentioned, terms like defund and abolition are polarizing and politicized. I don't think that they should be, but they are. And so in this way, I think the ACLU of Minnesota has taken a step back and said, let's reground the conversation, because defund can seem like a scary term. If you think we're just going to drain all of the budget, no one's going to be able to, like, we're going to have a 911 call come into a call center and no one's going to respond. That's not what we're asking for, right? What we're asking for is, if you don't send, say, 10 armed officers on a call for someone who's having a mental health crisis, but instead you send a team that's designed, trained, equipped to handle calls in which someone's having a mental health crisis and they know how to respond, kind of diffuse the situation and bring that individual either the support or to a location that will keep them safe, then you don't need as much of a police budget, but that team needs the funding to be able to have the background and the equipment that they do need to be able to respond. So it is not taking away that budget simply as some sort of punishment, but instead moving that money to support another service. And you wouldn't need that money there because that other service exists, and you would not have to respond to those calls. So you're not being stretched so thin.
Yeah. Based on your work and what you know about in the community, what do you think, like, in the next 3 to 5 years, what do you think people can realistically expect? What kind of changes?
The next 3 to 5 years. I think that right now, given the spotlight on these issues, we will likely and hopefully see different conversations and then implementation of new policies surrounding both use of force and intervention. We will see reforms in police training and de-escalation of tense situations to avoid the use of violence and the use of force. All of that being said, that's not enough. It's not enough because we've seen reform efforts, and I think that we need more change. We need larger scale change. And I think that goes beyond just policing and community safety and first response. I think that there are larger systemic issues at play. And it's great that we're having a conversation about policing. I hope we will also have a conversation about bail reform. I hope that we'll also have a conversation about the issues with prison and mass incarceration and reentry. And all of these go hand in hand, and we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. So what do you think we as members of the community can do to contribute to this work? Like, do you have any ideas of what we all can do to help?
Yeah, I think showing up first is paramount. Having the conversations, talking to people in your lives, having difficult conversations, that is imperative to the work. I can't be at everyone's dinner table, nor would I be welcome at everyone's dinner table, nor would I feel comfortable there. But you're at your dinner table and you have your family's ear and your friends' ears, and use that. Have the conversations, show up every day, and do that part. Take to the streets. If something feels unfair, if it looks unfair, if it seems unfair, we have the First Amendment for a reason, and you should use it. And you should be protected under it. And if you're not being protected by the First Amendment to voice your own opinions, I will fight for you. Mm-hmm. But utilize it. Get involved. If you have special skills, if you have a background in organizing, put that to work. If you have a legal degree, volunteer. If you have a medical degree or really any background whatsoever, and you know that there are going to be large gatherings, hopefully post-corona, but like large gatherings, and you feel comfortable, go and offer services to try to help people attend to the fact that if they're being hit with tear gas, you know how to treat them, bring supplies. Yes, that's the thing that I would say. The main thing is to show up and have conversations and make sure that these issues don't go unresponded to anymore.
Are there any resources at the ACLU that you would like people to be aware of particularly?
So I would say if you have had your civil liberties violated or threatened in any way, go submit an intake. We're reading them. If you have an interest in, for example, if you're a lawyer at a firm, whatever it is, and you have interest in doing pro bono work and volunteering, please go. We have a volunteer page where you can find all of the information you need to be able to put your skills to work. I think I wish that more people, I guess, knew that when they're submitting an intake, they don't need to be worried that we're not looking at them. We are reading through all of them. And to the extent that you need someone to reach out to, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll throw my contact information in the chat as well. You can reach me on my email. We'll try to respond as soon as I can.
Yeah. How many intakes does the ACLU usually receive?
It is hard for me to answer that question because the level of intakes that I know of are in a post-COVID and post-George Floyd world. And since then, our intakes have exploded. So I don't know that the level of intakes in I want to say less eventful year are quite that high. But we've been very busy.
Mm-hmm. Do you in general, like for example, now on your docket, do you have like hundreds of cases and when you say the volume is high, what's the
what does that mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so no, luckily I don't have hundreds of cases. I think it would be really hard to do my job effectively if I had hundreds of cases. Frankly, it seems to deprive people of their constitutional rights when their attorneys, particularly public defenders, have hundreds of cases and don't have sufficient time to dedicate to the work. They are doing absolutely everything, right, for those clients and working overtime around the clock, morning, night, weekends, whatever it may be. But it's just not physically possible to effectively represent someone when you have that many cases. My caseload right now looks like, so the journalist lawsuit that I mentioned, the lawsuit on behalf of protesters that I mentioned, we have sued the Minnesota Department of Corrections a couple times because of their mishandling of COVID in state prisons here. We also have a lawsuit against Hennepin County and the city of Minneapolis and the Minnesota Park and Recreation Board for their ejection of homeless individuals from encampments, particularly during COVID times, in which shuttling people either into shelters or causing mayhem by just ejecting people from their tents exposes them to COVID. And that is dangerous, where they could quarantine, isolate within their own tents. And we should just have a moratorium on those forceful evictions, at least for now. And frankly, the governor's executive orders have said as much. But other cases that I have, they vary. A lot of my casework personally has been paused, whereas other team members are ongoing in their cases that are pre-corona and pre-murder of George Floyd. That being said, because I was new and didn't have such a heavy caseload of those non-COVID, non-murder of George Floyd response cases, I took on a lot of the new cases that were coming into the office.
Gotcha. I noticed in the chat that there's a question that Liz posed. Given that police departments are resistant to change, can you talk more about how you structure cases to try to ensure that change will happen, and what makes a good case?
So I think that's a good point, that police departments can be resistant to change, have been resistant to change. That's assuming that you even get them into court to begin with. How we structure the cases to ensure that change happens, that depends entirely on the circumstances of the case, but largely comes in the form of relief that we're requesting. So the form of relief that you'll see that is being requested is not, for example, just money. We are asking for policy changes, training, de-escalation versus use of force, additional training on the impact of the type of force that they're employing. So tear gas, rubber bullets, tracer markers, paint markers. Not only how do you use them, but what type of injuries do they cause to people? So that you know the impact every time that you fire a rubber bullet at someone and you think, oh, rubber can't hurt so much. Well, there was a photographer, for example, who came to cover the protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. She was hit with one of these less lethal projectiles, and she's now blind in one eye. That is something that she's going to carry with her for the rest of her life. It has impacted her ability to do her job. And we shouldn't be discounting that these have real impacts on individuals, whether you are permanently injured, whether you are dead. I mean, rubber bullets, for example, are not meant to be fired directly at someone. And that's just the truth. And so we need additional training and understanding to make sure that when you are using these tactics, if you have to use them, that you are doing so in the way that they're intended and to minimize the amount of impact on individuals.
I actually know someone personally who he helped with one of the protesters who also got shot in the eyes, and at the moment they were looking for attorneys, and I should have thought about ACLU, and we were struggling to think who will be able to provide the most help. So it is a very sad thing that happens definitely to more than one person. So
Absolutely.
I received another question in the Q&A, which the question is, what do you see as the primary barriers to divestment of police funds, and how to respond to those concerns?
Sure. I think that the barriers to divestment is multifaceted. The first is there needs to be a groundswell of public support for divestment. How do you get that groundswell? It is hard to convince a society that is so used to, when you have an issue, you call 911 and the police come, right? When you are constantly told that, and I mean, even as a little kid, it's when you have an issue, you call 911, the police come. It requires that we reimagine and constantly have the conversation of what else can we do. So if you are, for example, under the influence of some sort of drug, then I don't know why you would have to call 911 and they would send armed police officers, unless, for example, there's some sort of reason to think that that individual is armed or dangerous. But if what you are taught is to call 911 and someone will be to come help you, it doesn't need to be armed police officers. It can be someone else. So the first barrier, I think, is that there has not been enough conversation, and hopefully we'll see additional conversations surrounding the fact that when situations arise, 911 can be a dispatch center. It just doesn't need to only dispatch police. The other barrier, I think one of the crucial things, is police unions. They inhibit change. That is not to say that I think unions are bad. I work for the ACLU. We support public unions. That being said, police unions have made it extremely difficult for there to be meaningful change. So, for example, when cities grant immunity to officers, that they indemnify officers, meaning they're going to pay whatever is coming up. When both cities and insurance companies insure officers, saying, you know, if you are sued and you have this much liability, you're not on the hook for it personally, or even the department's not on the hook for it. We pay for it. When there is no personal financial stake in it, there is very little motivation to change. I think, and I hope that the negotiations that are currently ongoing between the police union, our police union here, and the city of Minneapolis will be productive. I hope that they will. I don't have a lot of confidence that they will, particularly with the fact that with the individual who's in charge of the police union here. I think another barrier to divestment is that, and I can understand why this one would happen, but I think another barrier is the fact that it is scary to think about the fact that you may lose your livelihood if we divest from police and you're one of the officers that gets cut under this budget, because they don't need as many officers on the force if we have other teams that are responding. I completely understand. That is a scary thing to think about. It is scary. And a lot of people right now during COVID times are dealing with this economic impact of job loss. That being said, to the extent that we have divestment, it should be part of the conversation that we can provide training and support, not only to find other employment opportunities, but also for them to, if they want, to serve on these responding teams and to have that training and that background to say, serve, to respond to mental health crises if they want to respond to substance abuse crises if they want to. It just doesn't have to be an armed, you don't have to be a police officer, you don't have to be armed with a badge, a gun, and whatever else to do that. So yeah, I can understand why that would be a barrier. I think that the conversation needs to move past that and explain and provide opportunities to say, if you are not employed here, it is still our motivation to find you employment and to have your livelihood. We want you to be working and a productive member of society. We should want that for everyone.
Yeah. I remember when we touched base about this conversation the other day, something you said that really stuck with me, which is the mother of protesters, person of color, or police officers. Can you please share with everyone what you said to me and like how you talked about the similarities there, for example, between the mothers of these groups?
Sure. So I think one thing that we should be able to find common ground in is this fear of losing our loved ones. And that should be what propels the conversation and drives the force behind wanting to change what the system looks like right now. And that's because we talk often about the mother of, say, a Black boy who is going to go out into the world, and she fears every day and every minute of that individual going out into the world and not making it home to her at night. I understand. I'm a new mom, and I am very afraid for the day that my son goes without me, and I don't know if he's going to come home because of who he is and the color of his skin. That said, there are partners of police officers. So take, for example, in a heteronormative couple, a wife of a police officer, a male police officer, who leaves every day. And that wife is at home, and she too is afraid that her loved one is not going to make it home to her at night. Both of these individuals, the mom and the wife, should want and be pushing for systemic change in police, because they want their loved ones to come home every night to them. And that is the driving force. And it should be the root of the conversation that we're having, is that how do we make it so that we can guarantee that both of these individuals come home every day to their loved ones? And the way to do that is to make it so that on both sides, policing is less reactive. Police officers will be safer if communities that they are policing are not afraid of them or angry at them. And so they should be, I think, the primary drivers of change, because they want to guarantee that they get to come home safely at night too. And that change happens when community trusts you, when they want you around, when they're not afraid that you're patrolling or aggressive or reactive, that they're not afraid that you're going to stop them for a routine traffic stop and they are going to be shot, like Philando Castile.
Yeah, I think I thought that was a very powerful response to how we can find common grounds and how to respond to the barriers in these polarizing conversations, and to focus on the commonality, how everybody just cares about their loved ones and want them to be safe. I think that's very powerful. So I noticed that it's 12:51, and so there are 9 more minutes. So I just want to give a moment to encourage everyone to send us questions if you have some. And while we're waiting for like other questions, is there anything else that you like our conversations haven't touched on that you may want to share with everyone, share with the audience?
I'll start with, I threw my email in the chat. Please don't hesitate to email me. I'd love to be able to continue the conversation, discuss anything. If you want to have a private conversation about, what you agreed with, disagreed with, how you can get involved, please contact me. Otherwise, I think I just want to encourage individuals both to put their voices out there, and it's necessary to have these discussions on community safety and policing. It's necessary to know that there's so many amazing community organizations that are doing work. So the NAACP chapters here in Minnesota, the Legal Rights Center, Minnesota Freedom Fund, grassroots organizations that work directly in the community that can further this conversation. They're tackling these issues head on. I highly recommend reaching out, getting involved with them as well. It doesn't have to be through us. Have conversations also about the other different systemically racist institutions like the bail system, other versions of the criminal legal system, prison, mass incarceration, reentry, fines and fees. Just every part of this is so multifaceted and also needs to be dismantled for there to actually be justice in the world. Then it remains an elusive dream at this moment, but I think that we can get there provided that we at least start having these conversations and working to make change. So yeah, that's what I'll say. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also happy to talk to anybody offline as well. Just thanks for having me.
Yeah, I posted some links there. These are the links that Isabella sent me earlier, the link to ACLU's intake, the links on the cases that ACLU is doing, and the link for attorneys to volunteer. And so we encourage everyone to check it out. So as you were talking about the other issues that contribute to systematic racism or other aspects that we should have conversations about, one of my friends is very interested in the conversation and topic about civil asset forfeiture. And before I was moderating this conversation, he told me that if there's an opportunity, he would love for me to ask the following question, which is, can you talk about the concerns of the ACLU relating to civil asset forfeiture by the police and how it impacts the poor and minority populations? He said that he will watch the recording afterwards to try to hear the answer. I don't know if this is a topic that you're familiar with. And
yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So civil asset forfeiture, I guess, just as a background, is when there's any sort of, let's say, link between some sort of asset, be it a car, money, cell phone, whatever it may be. The police seize it, keep it, and at some point you lose your right to it, and they then own it, and they can, say, sell it and get a profit from it. And that is bananas. I have no idea how we let this happen, but this definitely impacts particularly marginalized communities of color, the Black community. So if you think about the fact that the criminal legal system is so oversaturated in terms of its representation of communities of color in the system. So be it from pretrial to trial to post-conviction. The primary people that are in that system are those that are having their assets forfeited, right? And so they'd have to, for example, sue to get back one of their belongings to prove that it didn't have any sort of link to a crime. I guess we don't have a case on that, but we did, for example, within the last legislative session last year, we've been pushing for legislative change on this issue, because it shouldn't be that the baseline is if you, for example, are accused of a crime or somehow related to a crime. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a crime. Like, it could have been somebody used your cell phone for a crime, and so now they take your cell phone and they seize it, or even your car, they take your car and seize it, and you have to sue them to get your own car back, even though you weren't charged with anything or even accused of anything. Yeah, so there have been pushes for change in this area. They've been primarily on the legislative policy side of things. Hopefully, we will see change at some point. But yeah, it's a wild concept. It's not widely known. I'm glad people are talking about it. So I'm glad that your friend brought it up. We should be talking about it, because you can't just go around taking people's things and then being like, oh, they're mine now unless you sue me. And if you don't succeed, then I can sell your belonging for cash.
Yeah. It definitely is something that upsets him quite a bit, and I also I'm glad he brought it up to me too. I admit that previously I was not aware of the concept as well. So, and honestly, today's conversation has been extremely educational for just me alone. So I feel very thankful for the opportunity to be moderating this, and um, as an immigrant myself, I've had my struggles with the system, but not anywhere close to what the Black folks experience in the system. So I feel I'm very privileged. So, and I really appreciate you coming here today to chat with us about this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks to everyone for showing up, and I hope you continue to show up and continue to have these conversations. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I don't see any other questions. So I think this is it. If Sumra and Liz, if there's anything from you guys to wrap this up. Oh, I see Sumra says, thank you, Isabella and Joy. So thank you, and best of luck with the work. And we look forward to reading about it in the news and
Thanks.
paying attention to it.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.